Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to our federal policy update on child and youth homelessness. My name is Barbara Duffield, and I am the Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection. We have a lot to go through today, but still start with some general housekeeping while people are joining us. This webinar, as with all of our webinars, our federal policy webinars, will last 1 hour. Please, as you have questions throughout the webinar, ask the questions, if you can, in the Q&A box. That will help all of us track them. We will answer as many as we can during the course of the webinar. We try to track the chat box as well, but again, if you have questions, if you put them into the Q&A box, that really helps us out. To let everybody know that we are recording the session, and it will be posted on our website shortly. We also have the PowerPoint deck as a PDF. We will put that in the chat box at multiple times, and you will also receive that as well. We do issue certificates for attendance, so look for that. And then finally, if you would like to continue the conversation on this or other issues related to child, youth, and family homelessness, we do have an SHC community on Slack, so we can keep the conversation going there. Without further ado, brief introduction for those of you for whom this is your first Schoolhouse Connection federal policy webinar. We're a national organization working to overcome homelessness prenatal through post-secondary, through advocacy, practical assistance, youth leadership, and research and evaluation. You can find a lot more on our website, and please join our newsletter for additional updates. And with that, I will turn it over for an introduction from our co-presenter.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everyone. My name is Darla Bardine. I'm the Executive Director of the National Network for Youth. We are working to transform systems so that no young person in America experiences homelessness. We do this through federal policy advocacy, partnering with youth with lived expertise of homelessness, and we also support communities on the ground to implement local strategies. And we also have more information about our work on our website. Thanks.
Thank you, Trinity. So we posted this webinar, I want to say 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, and the agenda has changed because things continue to change in 2025. So what we'll really spend our time focusing on today are 5 main topics. First, we'll talk about the status of federal funding. For those of you who are in education or early care, this is the fiscal year 2026 funding. So what we talk, it's really the next school year, 2026, 2027. We will talk about the status of employees who were fired during the government shutdown at the U.S. Department of Education. We will talk about very recent news as of 2 days ago, when the Trump administration announced it was moving 6 offices, including K-12 and post-secondary education, from the department to the Department of Labor. Our friends at the National Network for Youth will share the status of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act competition, and we'll probably spend the bulk of today's conversation also on new news within the last 2 weeks, which is the release by HUD of the 2025 Continuum of Care and Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program Notice of Funding Opportunity. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to TJ to talk about federal funding.
Thanks, Barbara, and hello, everyone. My name is TJ Lucas, and I'm the Senior Manager of Federal Policy here at Schoolhouse Connection. In a former life, I was a congressional staffer working in the Senate on education, housing, health, and appropriations issues. So I'm glad to be here today to share a little bit more about the federal budget and where we are currently in terms of funding FY 2026. As many of you may know, we just experienced the longest government shutdown in history, lasting 44 days, from October 1st through November the 12th. In the agreement to reopen the government, Congress did fund several, 3 in particular, bills for the full FY26 budget year, which will last through September 30th, 2026. That was the Departments of Agriculture, Veterans Affairs, Food and Drug Administration, Military Construction, and Legislative Branch. This does include full funding for SNAP and WIC through September 30th, 2026, something we heard a lot about during the shutdown. All of the remaining federal bills are currently funded through January 30th on a temporary basis, including most of the programs that we care most about within the early childhood education, housing, homelessness, and health programs. Of the 12 appropriations bills, as part of the agreement to reopen the government, The language was included to reverse some of the federal firings that happened during the shutdown. As many of you are aware, on October the 10th, the Trump administration issued reduction in force notices to many employees at the Department of Education. This did include the small specialized team overseeing the Office of Homeless Education, including the McKinney-Vento and EHCY program. The language in the agreement to reopen the government ensured that these employees would be reinstated and that there was a pause placed on the administration's ability to issue any similar reduction in force notices at least through January 30th, 2026, as long as the funding agreement lasts. This means that all of the employees that received RIFs during the shutdown have been reinstated, including the employees in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, including the small specialized team overseeing homeless education. They are back at work. As part of the agreement to reopen the government, the reversal of the RIFs is, as I stated, only in effect through January 30th. A bipartisan group of House members wanted to go a step further and signal to the administration that there is support for ensuring the permanent reinstatement of these officials. Representative Summer Lee, Democrat of Pennsylvania, Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska, and Representative Jimmy Panetta, Democrat of California, led 30 of their colleagues in sending a letter urging for the permanent reinstatement of officials overseeing programs serving students experiencing homelessness and those in foster care. We were super excited to see this specialized letter uplifting the unique needs of children and youth experiencing homelessness, as well as those with experience in foster care. And on the next slide, we will talk about just where we are with the remaining 9 bills. This does include the bills overseeing the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, HUD, overseeing housing programs. Many of you who have attended a webinar previously have some information about how the bills have come out. The biggest priority that we want to reiterate is that the House bill reflects the president's cuts and priorities and was largely passed in a very partisan manner. That meant that only one party voted to advance it. In the Senate, the bills were actually done in a bipartisan manner, which rejected many of the cuts that were proposed during the president's budget proposal earlier this year. Most of those bills have passed in a very large bipartisan manner. So the split in Washington isn't necessarily Republican versus Democrat. It tends to be Senate versus the House. And so how they will come together and find compromise on a negotiated language remains to be seen. But on the next slide, we start identifying specific programs that have an impact for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. This is the education budget broken down by how the Senate and how the House budgets were passed. As you can see with Title I Part A, migrant education, Title I Part D, and Title III, there were cuts and eliminations from the current funding level in the House package, but the Senate either level funded or slightly increased. On the next slide, we highlight some of the early childhood programs that we care most about. And while there were some level funding in both packages, there were also programs that were eliminated in the House and level funded in the Senate, including the preschool development grants. Childcare means access, means parents in schools, and the IDEA preschool grants. On the next slide, we have the higher education funding, where federal work study was cut and the supplemental education opportunity grants were eliminated, but Pell Grants, TRIO, and Gear Up were all level funded in both categories. I do think it's important to note here that programs that have large bipartisan support tend to fare well in both the House and the Senate, like McKinney-Vento's Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. And on the next slide, these are the 4 programs most targeted to supporting children, youth, and families as well as the HUD homeless assistance grants. As you can see, they were level funded with the exception of the youth homelessness demonstration program. The House eliminated the program while the Senate did include level funding. This is important to note that we have large we have a large swath of support amongst Republicans, and most of our advocacy efforts, which many of you participated in, and we thank you for that, to help educate members of Congress, particularly Republican members, on the importance of these programs, how they're utilized in their districts, and we'll talk more about advocacy a little later. On the next slide, want to give you just an overview of some of the scenarios that can happen come January 30th. So between now and then, we could either reach a full year funding agreement for all 9 bills that remain, funding for some of the 9 bills, which means another potential mini bus, as it would be called, and and another short-term continuing resolution, which could either be kicking the can down just a couple days, weeks, or months, or we could have another year-long CR similar to what happened last year. There is also the possibility that another federal government shutdown could materialize. In all of the scenarios we envision, EHCY, RHYA, and the HUD homeless funding is likely to be intact. The biggest unknown continues to be the administration and whether or not it will try to withhold funds that Congress has appropriated or do any other efforts to undermine this funding going out. On the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Barbara to talk more about some of the recent developments happening this week on restructuring the Department of Education.
Thanks very much, TJ. So again, just two days ago, on the next slide, there was an announcement from the U.S. Department of Education that as part of the overall effort to dismantle the Department of Education, 6 major offices would be moved to different federal agencies through interagency partnerships. According to these agreements, the policy and the statutory oversight would remain with the U.S. Department of Education, while grant management and other functions would move to other agencies. So on the next slide, we sort of lay out which programs would be moving where. So the bulk of elementary and secondary education, so K-12 education, would be moving to the Department of Labor. So these are all of the programs that would move, not all of the programs, but most of the programs, the ones that are most relevant to children and youth experiencing homelessness. You'll see it does include the McKinney-Vento Act program, most of the formula funded programs, and also some competitive programs, charter schools and full community schools. On the next slide, to see other programs moving to different agencies. So within the Office of Post-Secondary Education, TRIO and Gear Up would move to the Department of Labor, and the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education also would move to the Department of Labor. I want to note here that this is where the basic needs for post-secondary student program would live. However, also last week, the administration effectively ended that program. We provide a link in the PowerPoint, which you'll get both during this and after this, to a great statement from our partners at the Hope Center about what it means to terminate the basic needs for post-secondary education program. Also related to higher education, the Child Care Access Means Parents in Schools campus program would move to the Department of Education, and the programs remaining at the U.S. Department of Education for now include special education, federal student aid, and the Office of Civil Rights. So what happens to the funding? According to the administration statement, states will continue to receive all the formula education funds. They'll just be getting it from the Department of Labor. And also there was an assurance within the statement that grantees shouldn't expect any disruptions. They should still stay in contact with their respective Office of Elementary and Secondary Education staff. What we don't know on the next slide, or the question is, when is this all happening? The expectation is that the Office of Post-Secondary Programs will move first, and that will occur over the next 3 months. And then after that, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education Programs, the administration of those programs would happen. So basically not for a while. On the next slide, why is this a problem? So one could look at this and say, well, you're just moving programs from one agency to another, but it's extremely problematic. Again, the policy and oversight remaining at the Department of Ed while grant administration moves to other agencies doesn't make any sense, specifically as it relates to children and youth who are homeless or in foster care. Most of what those Department of Education staff do is not related to grant administration because they're formula grants, but it connects directly to the policy and the educational protections and the assistance that state and local educational agencies need in order to implement the law. It's also true that the Department of Labor or other agencies don't have the subject matter expertise, and they actually aren't used to working with state and local education agencies. And the final point to make here, and there are others I could make, but just to say that it does not reduce bureaucracy to have federal programs co-managed by two different federal agencies. It actually adds disruption, it adds bureaucracy. So again, this is part of the Trump administration's priorities. It's considered they're trying to do a proof of concept to show that the Department of Education isn't necessary. But for children and youth who are homeless and those in foster care, it is absolutely necessary. We have a resource here that spells out specifically what the Department of Education, and not only the Department of Education, is required to do for children and youth who are homeless and why it matters. So I would invite you to take a look at that. With that, I'm going to, last piece to say before we turn it over to Darla, is there any effort to stop these changes from happening? Yes, litigation is very possible. We've also seen statements on both sides of the aisle about concern in Congress about this move. And it's very possible that this could become part of those FY 2026 appropriations bills moving forward. We heard from the subcommittee chair in the Senate, Tammy Baldwin, just yesterday about trying to insert language into the funding bills to stop any more transfers from happening. So that's what we know as of today, 2 days later. And I'll turn it over to Darla to change topics again.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm going to give an update on the status of 2025 funding for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, which is administered at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So if you applied for Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funding this year, you should have received your notice, whether you received a grant award or not. What we know is that there are fewer RHYA grants were awarded this year because the grant award amount increased from 200,000 or 250,000 to 350,000 maximum this year. That's because they eliminated the street outreach program as its own standalone grant application and instead embedded the street outreach program kind of into the three other NOFOs, which are the maternity group home, transitional living, and basic center program. There is not a public list of yet everybody who was awarded a grant. And we know that some folks didn't find out if they got a grant or not before the government shut down. And so those folks did receive letters after the federal government reopened. And it seems as if all of those providers were not awarded a renewal grant. We are trying to track what exactly happened with this grant award process, because we also know that quite a few providers scored 100 and were not given a grant. And so if you didn't apply for an RHYA grant, you did not get it, please consider completing the short form. We have the link here, and the link is in the document that TJ has been sharing. And also, I think Trinity just shared the link in chat. Now I'm going to shift again, moving to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The 2025 notice of funding opportunity for the Continuum of Care program and Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program. So first of all, there's a joint NOFO, notice of funding opportunity, that was released last week. $3.9 billion is available, and within that includes $228 million for the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program. I want to take a little bit of a step back. So a Continuum of Care is a HUD-created regional or local planning body that applies for this federal funding, distributes these federal funds, and coordinates the funding. And this is within the Housing and Homelessness Services program. The Youth Homeless Demonstration Program, for those not familiar, is a competitive grant within the continuum of care to coordinate plans and implement strategies to address homelessness among young people under the age of 25. So that's just a little bit of big picture. I think of great importance. So this application was released last week. It's due January 14th. In the announcement last week, it says that awards are expected May 1st. That means that there are quite a few continuums of care that are going to have some type of gap in funding. Some continuums of care, their current grant from HUD ends in January. Others are February, others are March. Not all continuums of care are on the same start and end date in terms of this federal funding stream. And so it is anticipated that there is going to potentially be gaps in funding, depending on how other advocacy and litigation efforts are, which I will talk about later. Next slide, please. So we're not going to go into detail about all the things in the COC, or we'd be here for a couple of hours, but we're going to go through some kind of big major overall changes. So Tier 1 funding, which is usually protected, is down from 90% to 30% of a COC's total funding. Tier 2 funding is now fully competitive. For Tier 2, this includes all project types, including YHDP and domestic violence bonuses. Also, all project types must be ranked and scored under the merit review, which includes a number of new requirements, which are detailed in the NOFO. And since the entire continuum of care portfolio is now competitive, even small scoring differences could lead to major funding losses. An impact on youth serving programs, and this has been, an issue for years because HUD's outcome metrics were designed for chronically homeless adults. Many youth serving programs don't always score in Tier 1, and we know that Tier 2 is going to be highly competitive. Next slide. Another major change is that spending on permanent housing is now capped at 30%. So 30% of your COC funds can go to permanent housing. Currently, most continuums of care spend about 87% on permanent housing. So this is a pretty dramatic shift. And this includes, permanent housing includes permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and joint projects. The additional 70%, so there's the permanent housing that can be 30%. The additional 70% can be spent on transitional housing and supportive services only, and HMIS. An issue that I just want to highlight is that due to a combination of definitions and eligibility requirements, providers cannot move clients from permanent housing to transitional housing or vice versa, meaning that providers can't just change like a current permanent housing project to transitional housing and keep the same clients in that program. The clients in the permanent housing program will actually have to exit, and then they'll need to enter different folks into transitional housing. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Trinity.
Thank you, Darla. Hi, everyone. My name is Trinity. I'm from the National Network for Youth. So what do these changes mean for youth and families? Well, first, for YHDP, the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, as Darla said, there's no funding for new YHDP communities under this NOFO. It's just renewal, replacement, and reallocation. And there's going to be no new funding overall, not just YHDP, but no new funding for transitional housing, rapid rehousing, joint projects. They will allow the renewal of existing transitional housing, rapid rehousing projects, but eligible costs are going to be limited. So if your YHDP community does already have a joint transitional housing rapid rehousing project, then you are eligible to apply for renewal, but just keep in mind, there's all these kinds of new restrictions on permanent housing. And then secondly, there are over nationally 16,000 permanent housing beds that are dedicated to youth under age 24 and 392,000 beds and units dedicated to families with children. And now we have that 30% cap on permanent housing spending that's also supposed to be very prioritized permanent supportive housing for the elderly and the physically disabled. So I think we can expect to see a pretty significant decrease in the number of beds and units that are going to be set aside for children, youth, and families, permanent housing beds and units. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the new scoring and merit review requirements. And as Darla mentioned, since all projects need to compete now, including YHDP, they're going to be, going through these different requirements. So big scoring incentives to require participants to take part in supportive services. This is under the merit review. 10 points if all projects in your COC have supportive services participation requirements, and 5 points if 50% of your COC's projects has these requirements. And for this particular requirement, there's no kind of scores listed in between it. It doesn't say up to 10 or anything. So it's kind of looking like if 98% of your COC's projects have participation requirements, you may only get the 5 points. And that's, a pretty significant decrease. In addition to this, transitional housing projects have some specific service requirements. Each participant in a transitional housing project has to engage in customized supportive services for 40 hours per week, each participant. And the NOFO does explicitly state that 40 hours can be adjusted based on your participant's job schedule, but it doesn't explicitly state if the 40 hours can be adjusted based on the participant's school schedule. So that's just one kind of lingering clarification that's needed, particularly for our youth participants. Another big scoring incentive under the merit review, these public safety initiatives, which is up to 13 points overall. So they want COCs to demonstrate that the state and/or local government that encompasses the entire geographic area has laws and/or protocols to ban encampments and public drug use. And those are two separate things for up to 2 points each. They also want to see standards for addressing individuals who are a danger to themselves or others, including through involuntary commitment. They want the state to be compliant with and implementing requirements for registering sex offenders. And finally, they want the COC to indicate that they comply with and assist law enforcement in doing things like breaking up encampments and getting those folks into services. Additionally, continuums of care will receive up to 4 points if all of their projects within the COC verify immigration status before enrolling someone in services. So that can be done through SAVE or in coordination with a governmental entity. And then finally, HUD states in the NOFO that it can reject applicants if a project currently or has previously shown a racial preference and/or has used a non-binary definition of sex in their programming. And, obviously all these changes are concerning, but particularly this last one, especially since under previous NOFOs, projects were required to, provide gender affirming services. So it's possible that this provision and maybe some others will be challenged in court, but nothing has happened quite yet. And now I'll give it to Barbara to talk about some additional implications for children, youth, and families.
Thank you, Trinity. And I see a lot of great questions in the Q&A. We will answer them as we can and get to them at the end. And then if we don't know the answer, we will get back to you. So I just want to provide a little bit more context on the housing pieces of this. For those of you who've been working in this field for a long time, as I have, we've seen a lot of shifts over the years, going back, to some of the early days, like the beginning of the continuum of care, where there was no set aside for permanent supportive housing, to the early 2000s, when we saw 30% of the HUD COC account be required to go for permanent supportive housing, then the Hearth Act, and then changes over time that essentially totally defunded or almost totally defunded, very heavily defunded transitional housing and supportive service only grants. So now we see another extreme coming in. So just as a reminder, for those of you who are less familiar with the housing world, coming from education or early care, rapid rehousing is short to medium-term rental assistance and services in the tenant's own unit, and there's no time limit on the housing itself. The idea is that the person in that unit would be able to be on their own, either in that unit or elsewhere at the end of the time. This is part of the cap. So I saw a question, what does permanent housing mean? The 30% cap does apply to rapid rehousing as well as transitional housing and joint projects. So according to this NOFA, there would be significantly less funding available for rapid rehousing. I want to state that part of the context for all of this, I think in the past, has been sort of a lionizing of rapid rehousing as like the silver bullet and a demonizing as transitional housing as bad. And the reality is that different models work for different people in different circumstances. So while rapid rehousing has been appropriate and successful for some families and youth, it's also had its share of concerns, and that's part of what we need to be talking about too. So particularly in high rent areas, some families and youth have had a hard time maintaining their rent after the assistance end, which contributing to evictions and more instability. And even based on HUD's own evaluations, many families had high mobility and other forms of homelessness a year after. So again, the loss of rapid rehousing as an option is taking one tool away from the toolbox, but it is not a tool that hasn't had its challenges as well. On the next slide, to talk a little bit more about transitional housing, again, temporary program run housing placement, time limited, meant to bridge people into permanent housing. There is now more funding in this NOFO for transitional housing. And while it does not work for everybody, it may be particularly appropriate for some youth and young adults and for some families. And our organizations, together with Covenant House International, produced a report during the pandemic specifically on youth supportive transitional housing and why that might be a particularly good intervention for some young people. So we want to provide that resource as well. On the next slide, I think it's been so long for programs because social services only projects weren't being funded at all. We sort of lost what you can actually do with supportive services only grants. So we thought it would be helpful to just pull straight from the regulations to list some of the things, activities that you can do with supportive service only projects. Again, these are services that are necessary to assist people to obtain and maintain housing. I won't read to you everything that's on the slide, but you can see here that there may be some pieces that are actually very helpful for young people, for families, everything from childcare, education services, etc. So I think it's time for us to look at this supportive services only projects again, particularly with the population of families, children, and youth in mind. And lastly, Trinity mentioned that because of this is a much more competitive NOFO, every point matters. And so I just wanted to pull out, and this may be, again, this has not been a part of the HUD Continuum Care Program that's gotten much attention from HUD in the past, which is the requirements specifically in the points available for collaborating on children and youth programs. So the previous NOFO was 3 points. It went down by 1 point to 2 points in this NOFO. But again, for those of you working in the early childhood space, written agreements between the COC and HUD-funded projects and for services ages 0 to 5, specifically listing some of the major early childhood programs, formal partnerships with school districts, and also policies and procedures to show that children, youth, and families are aware of their educational rights. So when every point matters, these points that have really kind of been glossed over in the past become more important. And those of you who are focused on children, youth, and families are in a good spot to sort of talk about that and how to make these robust within the applications. With that, I'll turn it back over to Darla.
Thank you. We've been getting a lot of questions about the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program or YHDP. We don't have the answers to all of them, but a little bit of background. So there was appropriated money specifically for the YHDP program. It did say up to a specific amount. Typically, the YHDP was administered as a separate NOFO. There appears to not be coming a separate NOFO because the appropriated amount that was allocated has been folded into this NOFO. So what you're seeing within this this NOFO is that there's 228 million in funding for YHDP renewal, replacement, and reallocation. There does not appear to be any funding for new communities under this NOFO, though I would say it's still a little bit gray. Now, a renewal is if you're reapplying for funding for an existing eligible YHDP project and its current activities. Replacement is creating a new YHDP project to replace a current one, and funds must go to youth projects only. Reallocation is shifting funds from one or more existing project to create one or more new projects that could go to a different subpopulation. So some of the major changes is all YHDP renewals and replacements must now compete. Previously, YHDP projects renewed non-competitively. Also, YAB approval is needed to renew or replace a project under a special innovative activity. So some YHDP grants had funded special innovative activities. So where this could impact is if you are a YHDP community, you have had a funded special innovative activity, and you've been basically getting it renewed every year. And if you have disbanded your youth action board, YAB or youth action board. And we know that a youth action board for the YHDP grants are only required for 2 years. And we know, unfortunately, that many continuums of care chose to stop investing in and partnering with young people after that 2-year time period ended. So if you are in a YHDP community where your COC has disbanded your YAB, then that will decrease the likelihood that you could get a special innovative activity project renewed or replaced. One interesting thing is something we've been advocating for is that YHDP reallocations must go to youth projects. This is good because previous NOFOs allowed youth money to be reallocated to non-youth projects, though this coupled with the fact that all YHDP renewals and replacements must now compete, we're not exactly sure how this is going to fare for young people. Next slide, please. So I had kind of hinted in the beginning that there are national advocacy efforts to offer, basically folks are advocating to Congress for there to be a legislative solution for all COC grants to have a 1-year extension, so a 12-month extension of current grants to prevent the gaps of funding that I had mentioned that some COCs are going to face. We also know that it is very, very likely there will be litigation. It is unclear if the congressional legislative advocacy strategy will be effective. It's unclear if the litigation strategy will be effective. So we know that many continuums of care, many communities are working to write this NOFO and apply just in case this NOFO is what will determine how these 3.9 billion funds are spent. We have included here on the slide, but also it is in the document, a link where you can participate in the advocacy efforts. You can contact your U.S. representatives, asking them to be supportive of a non-competitive 1-year extension for all eligible COCs. There's also an advocacy guide. Also, the House and the Senate have sent letters to HUD expressing their concerns over the timeline, the changes, the gaps in funding, all of that. Oh, and we are still kind of unpacking this joint COC YHDP NOFO ourselves, and we are providing a members only support webinar on Monday. It's not 2 hours, it's 1 hour. Sorry, it's from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. We are allowing non-members to join, so please register. We'll put the registration link in chat as well. And we'll do a deeper dive into the NOFO and hopefully have even more questions or more answers to your questions. So with that, I'm kicking it back to Barbara.
Okay, so Darla, there's another question there. We'll turn to you shortly. But so as Darla mentioned, this is a lot, and it's a lot that's happening quickly. And advocates and experts are diving in and thinking through the complications, the complexities. We know that it looks very different in different communities. So, and we also know there's a lot of surveys out, and that you don't have a lot of time to respond to surveys. So one of the things that we've done to help inform and shape what we do in response to this NOFO is include just some questions in the post-webinar evaluation. So, rather than try to put it separately, after this webinar, you'll get the usual post-webinar evaluation and the questions that we are most interested in. And if you don't have time even to do that, you could just type in the chat box. We're really curious how programs for families and youth in your continuum of care are responding. What are the things that they're considering? How are they responding to this? Again, there's a lot of focus and emphasis on unsheltered, on elderly, on disabled. There's not a lot of conversation. I haven't heard much conversation at all about impacts on families. So how are programs for families and youth in the COCs responding to this? If you're not directly working in a COC, if you are in a school district or an early childhood program or an institution of higher education, but you're connected, you participate in some way, just not in the everyday, how are these changes likely going to impact your work? So we're interested in sort of like the ripple effect of these potential changes. And we also know that there are other partners out there who are providing a lot of assistance. And specifically, where do we plug in? As organizations that are squarely focused on young children, on school-aged children, on youth and young adults, what would be the most helpful from our organizations to navigate these changes? So that's where we're looking right now, to try to keep our finger on the pulse so that we can be the most effective in this particular moment. And with that, why don't we pause, Darla, and take some of the questions that you can see here, and I'll look for some through them as well.
Yeah, Trinity, can you come on camera and help answer some of the questions too? I was trying to answer. One of the questions is, yes, we are allowing non-members to join our webinar on Monday. We will have kind of more legal guidance from the National Homelessness Law Center as well. And so we did put that link in. I know Trinity's been typing a bunch of answers. What are some themes of questions you've been answering, Trinity? Trinity, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. I've been answering questions in the Q&A. Barbara, I don't know if you meant a specific one in the chat that we missed, but I'll answer one that I was typing right now. Are YHDP programs held to the same merit review or scoring requirements? So the merit review technically applies to your whole COC's application. So yes, the YHDP is competing now within that COC bucket. So, I mean, some of the components of the merit review, I think, are just going to be, your COC might determine, right? So, for example, the one requiring supportive services. Well, you could get 5 points if only 50% of the COC's project requires supportive services. So, but your COC might tell all projects, hey, we need you all to require supportive services. So it's going to kind of be determined by which one you mean, but my overall general answer is yes.
I'll answer just a couple that are related to education. So there's a question, can you explain the NOFO changes point from 3 points to 2 points, and what does that mean? It just means that this NOFO it values collaboration with education and schools less, by 1 point less. I would argue that 3 points wasn't a lot and was too little in the previous NOFO, but 1 point less is 1 point less. So that's what that means. However, in this whole scheme of much more competition, 2 points is still important and needs to be attended to. There's also a question about use of McKinney-Vento funds through the education program for housing. Again, the education funds through the McKinney-Vento program cannot be used for housing currently. During the American Rescue Plan, they were allowed to be used for temporary housing, motel stays, for example. But for the education funding for McKinney-Vento, that has not been an eligible activity. It's educationally related, and there's other uses there, but it typically hasn't been used for housing. I'll turn it back over to Darla or Trinity for other questions.
Yeah, one I did answer, but maybe I'll just uplift because I thought it was a good question. How does the issuance of this joint NOFO for COC and YHDP programs kind of affect? I took it to mean affect YHDP programs. As I think Darla said earlier, it's hard, of course, to predict exactly how these award issuances are going to play out, but just this kind of combination of requiring YHDP projects to compete along with all the other projects, thereby increasing that competition, the additional YAB requirements that Darla was talking about for special project renewals, and then the fact that, it seems like they've put all the YHDP funding into this NOFO, which is just renewal, reallocation, and replacement. Kind of feels like they don't plan to issue a separate NOFO for new communities, which is what they usually do. It just doesn't look great for YHDP. It's just going to be, as with other projects, much, much more highly competitive in this kind of NOFO that's already can be difficult for youth providers because of the HUD metric outcomes that are for chronically homeless older adults.
And if I can add around the YHDP, the other thing that's different is that there's actually a cap on the amount of money that can go to YHDP. Previously, it was just non-competitive renewals. And if you add up total, all the YHDP funds that have been distributed over the past 8 years, it's much more than $228 million. So there's a lot, we have a lot of questions, and the 228 number comes from two different appropriations bills of YHDP funds that have not been released to new communities. Now it seems like it's folded into this, and it's being targeted to renewals, which would total more than 228 million. But I don't know that that means that there wouldn't be more than 228 going to young people. So we have a lot more questions than answers in terms of how this is going to play out.
Mm-hmm. I just saw one that came through. What about communities that have been awarded YHDP but haven't received your grant contracts? Will they be asked to reapply? I don't want to speak for as a whole, but I did talk to a provider who is in that situation. Maybe she's in the same grant cycle as you, who they were selected actually for transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and still haven't received their grants. But their program officer did tell them that those are coming by the end of the year and that they'll still be able to go through with the transitional housing, rapid rehousing since it was awarded. I think hers is FY23, so a while ago. So that's just what I heard from one provider who sounds like she's in the same situation as you, but I definitely double check with your program officer. And there's one in here, Barbara, a Q&A, no federal fund. It seems there's no federal funding amount dedicated to the refugee and immigrant school children in 2026, the Refugee School Impact Grant. Is that right?
I don't know the answer to that question. That's administered by ACF, so we can look that up and get back to you, but it's not one of the programs that we've followed closely. We do know that Title III funding for English learners is funded in the Senate and not in the House, but that particular program is not one that I know the answer to. I do see a question in, I think, the chat that maybe we can answer while we're looking at the other YHDP questions. Trinity, if you can move to the next slide, I think it actually is on the next slide. So there's a question in the chat about eligibility for SNAP and those changes. So we did include information on here. Obviously, there's a lot of attention with the lapse in November or in October related to the government shutdown in November. But another change to SNAP eligibility that didn't get a lot of attention that also went into effect on November 1st is eligibility changes that are now, now they are now fully in effect. There's no hold harmless anymore. Again, by way of background, the HR 1 bill cuts $187 billion over SNAP over the next 10 years. So the change that of most relevance for this particular webinar and focus is that people who are experiencing homelessness, veterans, and youth who are aging out of foster care they are no longer automatically exempt from work requirements just based on those statuses alone. They now too must provide proof of working or participating in a qualifying program 80 hours a month, unless they're exempt based on another reason. So, for example, being pregnant, medically unfit, caring for a child under the age of 14. And there are also certain lawfully present immigrants who are no longer eligible as well. So these are big changes for many and will require those of us working with families to and youth who are who need SNAP benefits to make sure they are if they're exempt for another reason, that they have the documentation of that, and that if they're not exempt but they are if they are working, they are in an educational program, that they're able to prove that, because so often that's the issue. It's not that they're not in education programs, it's not that they're not working, it's being able to prove that and provide the documentation of it. So we have a lot of work ahead of us on the SNAP front, and we'll be producing resources soon, specifically for those of you in the education setting, about the ways in which federal education funds can be used to help with food. So that's coming soon from Schoolhouse Connection. And I'll turn it back over to you, Darla and Trinity, for going back to the YHDP HUD-NOFO questions.
Yes, one I accidentally dismissed, so I'll answer right now. We have a youth YHDP permanent supportive housing program. We understand we will probably not receive funding through this NOFO, but does the new NOFO limit permanent supportive housing funding to elderly adults? The wording is confusing, yes. So what the NOFO exactly says under permanent supportive housing under the scoring section, the project will be designed to serve elderly individuals or those with physical disabilities. The units will prioritize these populations. So I take this to mean, yes, your program has to have designs that are appropriate for these populations, and technically they're only going to prioritize these populations. However, my guess, and I don't want to predict the future, but my guess is that yes, they're probably only or majority going to fund permanent supportive housing projects for the elderly and physically disabled. I think just putting that, saying we're only going to fund PSH for the elderly and physically disabled could probably open some litigation that they don't want to invite. But that's just, my reading of the NOFO. There's obviously still a lot of questions. But yeah. Let me see.
There's more SNAP questions here, Barbara.
I just answered one, or I tried to answer one, which is a question about why remove lawfully present immigrants. There's not a good reason for that. I think just reducing the roles in a general anti-immigrant climate that we're in right now, but not anything particular. I will read one more. Are the EHCY grants through the states anticipated to be available as the funding opportunity for school districts to apply to? In Wisconsin, the next grant application cycle is supposed to open in the spring of 26 for funding starting in the 26-27 school year. As of right now, there is no known disruption to McKinney-Vento EHCY funds, but what we need to watch is what happens early next year. Fiscal year 2026 funding for schools is forward funded, which means that the funding that Congress is working on right now doesn't become available until July 1st. So typically it's March or April when the Department of Education sends the state McKinney-Vento coordinators their allocations, and that is what we will be watching this year. But again, right now, the House and Senate both have the same amount of funding for McKinney-Vento. The big question mark is any disruption that might happen from the administration. So right now, the expectation is business as usual.
And there's a question in chat around SNAP. If there's any indication the SNAP Ed funding would be restored? I guess you had talked about the cut. I don't think so, right?
No. Oh, maybe if this is about the post-secondary.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, if we don't know the answers, follow up with email, please, because we can dig a little bit deeper if we're misunderstanding.
Yeah, we're doing our best. And then I see a question from Leah about, so there is a recent executive order on foster care. It's kind of HHS specific, but there are other pieces to it. We have no idea how it's actually going to be implemented. The EO was just released, so it's on our radar and we're tracking it. It talks about like housing and aging out, and so if you all remember from the first Trump administration, they created the FYI vouchers for youth in foster care or aging out or exiting foster care. And earlier this year, First Lady Melania Trump issued a press release, requesting 20 million for those FYI vouchers. So kind of our read of this and that is that the First Lady is really focusing on foster youth, aging out, and transitions, and that FYI vouchers seem to be safe and supported by this administration, which makes sense since they are the ones that created the voucher program during their first administration.
And another SNAP eligibility that I again accidentally put in the answer. I keep clicking the wrong button. If a parent of children under age 14, are they eligible for SNAP, or would they have to meet the work requirements? If they are a parent of children under age 14, then they fall into those exemptions. So they are exempt from the work requirement. And I know there's some in here I'm just not sure of the answer to, so maybe we can come back to.
There's a question, is in the NOFO, there was 14 points for COC mergers. Do folks see that as a realistic option for COCs in such a short amount of time? I mean, the time period is very challenging for all of this. There's so many changes there's just so many changes, even that we didn't get into. I think the reason for the January 14th deadline is because the deadline for the government to funding is January 30th. So given the advocacy push to get an extension, an automatic extension for existing under the current rules for an additional year into the final continuing resolution, which we imagine Congress will be working right up to the wire, I think that's part of the reason why the deadline is January 14th. And I do think it's going to be very problematic for many pieces, including that one as well.
And I will say, I'm not sure what's required with a merger, but we've seen a lot of COC mergers. So COCs not wanting, so communities not wanting to manage the administrative burden, which is heavy in terms of HMIS and all the COC requirements. So we've been seeing like balance of state COCs, which have typically been like multiple rural communities. We've seen balance of states getting larger in some places because again, counties or cities just don't want to deal with all the bureaucratic requirements of the COC, the NOFO, the regulations. It's way too complicated to get this critical money to providers doing this incredible work. And so, depending on what the merger requirements are, I actually wonder if like more smaller communities are going to say, yeah, we're not going to, like, we'll just merge with somebody else who will carry the administrative burden.
Thanks, Darla. We have just a couple minutes left. So two things we want to do. Again, keep the questions coming because if we can answer them afterwards, if we won't get to them in 2 minutes. But on the next slide, just to let you know, we are aware, and for us too, like keeping track of everything that's going on right now is a full-time job. One of the things that we've done at Schoolhouse Connection is to create what we call a live tracking of major actions. We are not CNN. It is not like live, but we try to curate the policy developments that are the most impactful for children, youth, and families. So that's one resource for you, as well as our federal policy page. Partners at National Network for Youth also have blogs and action centers. Both of us have newsletters, but those are just some additional resources. On the next slide, we have information about how to stay in touch with us. And on the next slide, again, there's the newsletter brief. I want to get Darla to the NNN for Y Summit slide. So maybe you could just fast forward to your summit. There we go. All right.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Please register. Registration is open to come to our summit. The sooner you register, the cheaper it is. Schoolhouse Connection does our education breakouts. We do Hill Day, help schedule meetings with your elected officials. You'll hear from young people. We have amazing breakout sessions. So please register. We hope to see you in DC. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for joining us. This is, I think, our 8th federal policy webinar of 2025. It might be the last one. We'll see what happens over the next couple months. But again, we really appreciate you joining us, sharing your questions. We'll try to answer those we didn't get to. And again, just really want to know what's happening in your corner of the world so that we can be better informed and we can be better advocates. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day and have a wonderful holiday next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.